Hi guys. All right, here we are, Unit 4. This is going to be our next, or at least the beginning of our next system in the body. Only just our second system, excuse me. And this is the axial skeleton. We'll do the skeleton in two parts. The axial skeleton is kind of your torso, your head and your torso. We'll get to the appendicular skeleton in our next unit, and that is the limbs. But so this is basically the bones that are attachment points in some cases, or really more bones that are protective of some of your other organs. So the skull, of course, is going to protect your brain. Your spine is protecting your spinal cord. Your thorax, your ribs and your sternum are protecting your heart and lungs, which we've talked about that before. And so we're going to go through the individual bones and some of the structures that are kind of unique about each one. Okay, so starting out with your skull, we'll talk about two different types of bones, the cranial bones and then the facial bones. And so these cranial bones are mostly like the top, sides, back of the skull. And so there are 8 of them, and they are places where muscle is attached. This helps, obviously, with the push-pull thing where we've talked about the muscles have to have something to work against and work with, and so they help with facial features, or not facial features, facial expressions, and moving your head side to side and all those kinds of things. The cranial bones also, like we've talked about before, are protecting your brain, which is a really big deal. Remember, you need a brain. It also is where your hearing organs are, your inner ear, and also your equilibrium, so your sense of balance. Okay, so I have tried for each of the bones to give you a little picture, and so you can kind of see it highlighted, because they are not pieced, just pieces. They are all kind of stuck together, and so that's why I give you those pictures. Just so you know, if at this point you have gotten the picture page from me to add to your notes, they may not be exactly the same, and so you may have to do kind of some searching to figure out which picture goes with what, but in class we'll get it figured out together. Okay, so first bone from the cranial bones is your frontal bone, which is your forehead. So it runs from kind of the top of your eye sockets all the way back to about the middle of your head. And it is called the frontal bone, really no other reason than it's in the front, and it is really kind of the main protection for that part of your brain that's right underneath it. Not a lot of stuff. There are some muscles that may be attached, that help you smile and help move your eyes a little bit, but not a lot other than protection going on there. The parietal bones, you have 2 of these. They're one on each side of your head, and so with this, so here's the parietal bone, so you can just see one side of it, but you have a matching one on the other side. And it is the first that we'll talk about. We'll get to some others that are joined to the other cranial bones by sutures. And these sutures are a type of joint. We'll talk about that when we do more with appendicular skeleton, where the joints are interlocked. These are non-moving joints. So you first off have the coronal suture, and this is the suture between your frontal bone and your parietal bone. So it's the one, it runs right across kind of the crown of your head, which is why it's called the coronal suture. And then the sagittal suture is between, so it starts kind of midpoint in your head and then just goes backwards. That's sagittal. The lambdoidal is between the parietal bones and then the occipital bones. Occipital bones are down here, kind of the back of your head. We'll get to them here pretty quickly. And then the squamosal sutures, there are 2 of these. They are on either side of your head. They are this little area right here. So the temporal bone is right, like your ear sits on top of it. So you've got one on the right side of your head and one on the left side. So you've got these 4 sutures that are part of attaching the parietal bones to those other cranial bones. Okay, so now the occipital bone. This is the back and the base of your skull. So I've got kind of the side view and then the view from underneath. Internally, and we'll look at this when we look like inside the skull that we have in the classroom, they form what is called the posterior, remember that means towards the back, cranial fossa. Fossa very often is used to refer to kind of like a bowl or an indention. And this is where your cerebellum sits down into your skull. So it's kind of like just a little resting place for your cerebellum. That's one of the parts of the brain. It also contains the foramen magnum, which is this little hole right here. So that essentially means big hole or large hole. Foramen is whole, magnum is large. And this is where the medulla oblongata, which is again part of your brain, connects with your spinal cord. So that hole is simply to allow your nervous system to pass, to go from your body up to your brain. You also have externally the occipital condyles, and these are little rocker-like shapes. They meet with the first vertebrae in your spine, and they allow your head to nod. And so that back and forth movement, there are little kind of nodules right here that are the occipital condyles. And then the external occipital protuberance, this is a knob on the back of your skull. Kind of depends on the person. If you kind of run your hand down the back of your skull, you can kind of feel a ridge there. This is where muscles attach, where you've got some ligaments attached that run down to your neck and to your back, and it helps with, again, different neck movements. Again, just a different kind of attachment point for those muscles so you can move your shoulders and do some of the other movements from that point. Okay, so now your temporal bones, excuse me, the picture is actually on the next page because I got really wordy on this one, but we'll kind of point some of these structures out when we get there. The temporal bones are two of them on either side of your head. Basically, your ear sits on top of your temporal bones. So they are below, or they're inferior to, those parietal bones. And they form internal structures. They're part of the cranial floor. So this is part of where your brain is resting. They also, towards the front, form kind of the sides of your cheekbones. That's called the zygomatic process. And so they meet, and you, again, if you really kind of push in kind of to the sides of your eyes or a little low, you can feel kind of a ridge there. That's the zygomatic process. You have the mandibular fossa, and remember, fossa means kind of bowl or kind of indention. This holds part of your mandible, so we'll talk about, so that's your mandible is your lower jaw, so it fits into the temporal bone. You have the tympanic region. This is just the area that surrounds what is called your external auditory meatus, which is really fancy words for like your ear hole. And so that's just a region. You have a styloid process, which again is a little projection that muscles are attached to for your neck. There is the very last bone that we'll get to is your hyoid bone, and it is also attached there. The mastoid region, if you feel right behind your ears, you have a big lump back there. That's where muscles are attached. And then internally, you have the petrous region. And so this is deep. So inside, this meets up with the sphenoid bone, another one of the cranial bones we'll talk about, that make up part of the middle cranial fossa, so that bowl, and it holds the temporal lobe of the brain. The other big thing that your temporal bones do, or they are kind of the housing for your middle and inner ear cavity. So this is where like your sense of hearing is, I guess, and then also your sense of balance, your equilibrium. Okay, so here's that picture I was talking about. So of course there's the temporal bone, you have an identical one on the other side. So a couple of things that we talked about, this whole thing would kind of be considered, or at least kind of this big circle, the tympanic region. Right in the middle there is your ear hole, the external auditory meatus. The zygomatic process up there is what's going up towards where your eye is, and so that's that cheekbone that you can kind of feel. It's pretty far to the side. The styloid process kind of comes down. It's kind of in kind of down below your jaw, like you can't feel it. That's a muscle attachment. The mastoid process is that big lump I said behind your ear. On here, here's the mastoid process. It sticks out a little farther. Maybe you can see it better. And then, oh, what was the other thing? Oh, the mandibular fossa. So this kind of indention, when we talk about your mandible, it kind of fits in, kind of like the ends of that bone fit into this little opening, and it's a kind of a rotation point where your jaw, like your jawbone kind of rubs. If your jaw pops, it's kind of that area where the popping happens. Okay, so now the sphenoid bone, this is, and actually all of these would be considered well, internally, sorry, those irregular bones that we talked about. The outer bones are going to be more of the like the flat bones, but this is definitely one of the irregulars. This is goes all the way basically across your skull. So if you look at that underneath view, that yellow, of course, is the sphenoid bone, and so this is with the lower jaw removed. You can also see it like from the front if you have a skull. But it is a lot of times called the keystone of the cranium. So it is, everything is kind of centered or, kind of resting or attached to this. Holds the pituitary gland, which is one of your major parts of your endocrine system. It forms part of your nasopharynx. Your nasopharynx is part of the back of your throat, essentially. Muscles are attached here that are attached down to your mandible, so it helps you raise, open and close your mouth. And then notice all these little holes, like around, they have foramen in the name, foramen this, foramen that. All of those, and they're on both sides, are holes for nerves. And so these are information about what you're tasting, about chewing, about swallowing, all those kinds of things. These nerves are the connection to the brain to help you know what to do. Notice there's some optic stuff in there too, because of the way this bone kind of sits. Some of the optic nerves run through there too, from your eyes to your brain. All right, now the ethmoid bone. This is a really funny shaped little bone to me, so it's another irregular bone. It is the most central in your skull, and it's between the sphenoid, which we just talked about, and the nasal cavity. So it is centermost. I know I'm showing it in that with the skull, but notice that you don't see much of it. It does come forward enough that it is a little tiny part of your eye socket, but for the most part, it just kind of sits up in the middle. It forms the roof of your nasal cavities. It's not like a flat bone. Your nasal cavities aren't just perfect round spaces, and so it's kind of excuse me, kind of a funny shape. It also is an attachment point for the covering on your brain. You have a brain, obviously, but you have dura mater, which is kind of like a sac that goes around your brain. It helps your brain to not move around too much. And that dura mater is attached to, like the little hook here, on your ethmoid bone. And so it provides kind of an attachment just to keep that sac stable. The sac is there, and we'll talk more about it, but there's fluids in there, an extra cushion, and this bone just acts as the hook. Okay, so now sutural bones. Along the suture, usually your lambdoidal, the suture between your occipital bone here. So here's your occipital bone, and then you've got your two parietal bones. You sometimes will see people, or you'll see skulls that have these little kind of just odd shaped bones. Pardon me, and they're filled in essentially when the fetus is developing, when the baby is developing, and the skull just grows too fast, and the sutures don't fill in like they normally would. So these little pieces of bone fill in, and so not everybody has these. It depends really just on genetics and the size of your skull. But some people do, and so this is one of those where you have kind of a funny count on bones as far as the actual number that can be different in everybody. Okay, so now facial bones. So this is, essentially like, below like your eyes and below down to your chin. There are 14 bones here, 6 pairs, 2 singles. And the first one is a single. It is your mandible. It's the largest, strongest bone in your face. It's your jawbone. It's kind of described as having a U shape, which is obvious, especially when you look at those pictures down there. Lots of attachment points for chewing muscles. They're attached up to your temporal bone and the styloid process. They're attached internally to some of the sphenoid and the ethmoid. It's where your lower teeth are anchored. They are kind of down in your jaw and held in there by your gums. And then also there are some holes here. There you've got the mental foramen is the big one, and it is a hole, little holes like right here, kind of on either side of like the corners of your mouth, kind of down low. This is the nerve, like if you've ever had teeth pulled or dental work done, when they give you a shot in anywhere along your lower jaw, they are getting the nerve that runs through that hole. Numbs most everything. All those of you who've had this done, and so you can't feel all the stuff they're doing. All right, the maxillary bones. There are 2 of these. I know the picture can be misleading, but they are actually fused, like right here between your lip. This is of some of the problems with cleft palate. This is part of what is not fused, but it's actually more kind of the roof of the mouth. But so this fuses and it forms your upper jaw, so your upper lip, and then kind of the middle of your face. So kind of between your lips and your eyes is where the maxillary bones are. You have the frontal process. So on the picture here, it's going up towards the frontal bone. So it kind of goes up the sides of your nose here on either side and forms kind of the bridge of your nose. And so, when you kind of push there on the sides, that's the maxillary bones. It also is the housing for your maxillary sinus. So they're kind of right there behind, like under your eyes, kind of under your cheeks. When you have like sinus infection, you can have any sinuses get an infection in them. This one's fairly common to see with kids, especially like kind of swollen eyes and puffy cheeks, if this is the sinus where the infection is, or the sinuses. Okay, so now the next couple of bones, the zygomatic process. There's 2 of these. These are basically your cheekbones. They connect to the temporal bone at that zygomatic process, and so they form kind of this whole part. So these are really your cheekbones. Again, it's just one of those facial features that is kind of different for everybody. Some people have very prominent zygomatic bones, and some don't. It just kind of depends. All right, so the next set of bones are the nasal bones, and these meet with the frontal bone above. So they meet up here with your forehead, like between your eyes almost, and then the maxillary bones to the side, and internally to the back they meet with the ethmoid bone. And so these form really kind of just the top of your nose right here. Okay, now the lacrimal bones. These are a little bit farther in, and these are the inside walls of your eye sockets. They meet with the frontal bone above, the ethmoid bone to the back, and the maxillary bones kind of to the side. They cover your lacrimal glands, your tear glands. That's where they get their name. And then you have the palatine bones. This is another kind of a fused set of bones. They are, or they complete the back of your hard palate, which is the roof of your mouth. So, when you kind of stick your tongue back there, you can kind of feel kind of a bump, and they're that part right there. They actually, though, project up into your head, like this little U shape. And so this picture is kind of always confusing to me, but you're feeling, or what you feel is this portion right here, and this is what's going up into your skull. And so yeah, so they are responsible for the roof of your mouth. All right, the vomer. This is kind of a weird one, but this is it's inside your nasal cavity, so inside your nose, and you can actually see it really well in this picture down here, even though I have that meant for the other set of bones. This little red line right here is the vomer. So when you look at a skeleton, you can see kind of this thin little feature right down the middle of the nose. That's the vomer, and it is I think I can write. There we go. And it is the division, excuse me, between your two nasal cavities. It's your nasal septum. All right, then you have the inferior nasal conchae, or conchae, or however people say it. I say conchae. And this is hard to see. I know there's those two little green dots kind of on either side of your nasal cavity. They make the lateral or the outside walls of your nasal cavity. So this is just real small little feature, like basically like the inside of your nose. Okay, so that was it on the facial bones. So now we have some of the orbits and the nasal cavities themselves. So the orbits, you have two eyes, obviously, and so those are called orbits or eye sockets, and these are the cavities, the holes where your eyes are. Your eyes are cushioned and surrounded by lots of fat, which sounds kind of weird to say, but later in the year when we dissect the cow eye, like it will be covered in fat, essentially. That's just for cushion. There are muscles in there that move your eyes. They are constantly moving your eyes from side to side as you look at different things. They're also, though, helping your eyes to focus by pulling on the lens and flattening it out, or letting it thicken up to focus in and out on things. So probably some of the most active muscles in your body are right here in your eye socket. This is also where those lacrimal glands are. I said they're underneath the lacrimal bones, and so they are your tear glands. And then your eye orbit is made of 7 of the bones we've just talked about. Some cranial bones and some of the facial bones. And so the frontal bones on top, the sphenoid internally, the zygomatic to the outside, the maxilla to the inside, the palatine, again, kind of to the bottom, lacrimal inside and ethmoid inside. So it's kind of a random thing, but this little picture kind of points them all out. There's other stuff on there. I really just want you to know the bones themselves. You're not going to have to label this on anything. Okay, now the nasal cavity itself is made of bone. Some of the cranial and facial bones that we've just talked about. The ethmoid, the palatine kind of below, and the vomer in the middle are the bone. And then the hyaline cartilage is kind of that external, like, what you think of as your nose. This cavity is lined with mucus cells. And the whole point of this mucus is that it will moisten drier air as it comes in. It just makes it easier on your lungs to function well if the air is somewhat moist. It also warms the air, and this again kind of helps maintain your core temperature, helps you to just maintain kind of that homeostasis internally that you need when you are breathing. And so, so this, of course, is a cross section, and you can see actually some of the other bones. There's the frontal bone on there, which I didn't list because it's not a huge part, as well as the phenoid bone kind of towards the back. But my main ones that I would have listed, obviously, are, I'm highlighting now, whatever. The vomer, here's the palatine part, and then you also have the there's the ethmoid up here. So there are more that are kind of surrounding, but those are kind of the big 3. This septum cartilage right here that they have labeled, I'm going to go back to pen now. That is like your nose. Okay, so coming to the end here, the paranasal sinuses. These are the sinuses that are like behind your face, basically, and they are contained by the frontal bone, the sphenoid, the ethmoid, and then the maxillary. And this picture is pretty good. It has all 4 of them labeled. And so you have the sinuses are essentially named for the bone that surrounds them. And so you have the frontal sinus there in green. So it is the one, like, you know, when you have sinus pressure in your forehead, it's because your frontal sinuses are have a lot of pressure in them. You have the sphenoid bone is this little red dot way back deep. And again, you can have headaches in different places. It has to do with what's happening with those sinuses. The ethmoid is those little kind of blue dots that look like they're kind of in a horizontal line above, or you know, like right around your eyes. That one, a lot of times, if your eyes kind of ache, your sphenoid has something to do with that. And then of course the maxillary sinus I already mentioned. This is the one a lot of times that you'll see, especially with littler kids, like if they have really puffy cheeks. A lot of times there's some kind of sinus pressure going on there. And so they're all clustered around your nasal cavity, so where you breathe in, because the air passes through there. It is, again, to filter out stuff that's in the air that you are breathing. It's to warm the air. It's to moisten the air. And when you're sick, when you're, you know, like when you have your head is stopped up, that's because part of your immune system is to just make a whole bunch of mucus. Like that's kind of the go-to for your immune system at some points, is like, well, we'll just make mucus, and that, you know, is going to help solve the problem. Unfortunately, it makes you feel not very good. And so so that's where kind of all that stuffy head comes from. Okay, last bone. This is kind of one of the weird ones. They don't really know where to put it. Is your hyoid bone, and it is a little U-shaped bone, fits right up under your chin, and it is the only bone that doesn't touch another bone, which is kind of weird. It is an attachment point for your tongue, so it helps with talking and swallowing, you know, moving stuff around in your mouth when you're eating. It is also an attachment for the neck muscles that move your larynx around, so your voice box. And so it again helps with swallowing and talking. If you watch, you know, like the CSIs and, you know, like the crime shows, a lot of times if someone has been strangled, then they oftentimes will have a broken hyoid bone. It's one of the things that the person doing the autopsy may look for as far as, you know, injury, cause of death kind of thing. Yeah. And on that happy note, that is the skull, which is our starting point for the axial skeleton. All right, thanks, guys.